Let's talk about your creative process, Dave, and the whole process of starting tracks to finishing tracks. Is it the same for your different monikers? How do you approach all of those?
I mean, it is pretty much the same. And for the most part, I mean, I might start off something thinking this is going to be an Akaboo track. I've got an idea for something and it's going to be an Akaboo track. Or I might start something off and about halfway through, when I've recorded the vocals, think, oh, this sounds like Akaboo or this sounds like Sunburst Band. Sunburst Band might be decided once the thing's finished, oh, this sounds like a Sunburst Band record. Somebody else might say that to me. They say, oh, it sounds like Sunburst Band. I think, oh, yeah, I suppose I could release it as that. Obviously, if I'm working on an album, then I'm starting tracks specifically as Sunburst Band. And I guess the process of starting it's just, I might have an idea for a bass line, for example. I might have an idea for a bass line. So I play in the bass line. And then next time I have a keyboard player in, I'll maybe say, can you come up with some chords maybe have an idea for the timing of the chords. I think one thing that's important to know is what you're good at and what you're bad at. And I can play chords, but I know I'm not great. My taste in chords is better than my ability to play them. So I like quite unusual, complicated and jazzy chords. And I know that if I get Michaela or Demetrius or one of these people I work with, they're just much, much better at that than me. So there are tracks which I've started on my own and I've played most of the keyboards, but for the most part, even if I started something on my own and I've come up with chords and whatever, I would still probably end up getting somebody else involved who I know has got more musical in terms of like their keyboard skills or whatever, that they can maybe replay those chords and slightly change the inversions and make it sound a lot better and add some sort of subtle nuances in terms of the way they're played. So it's not just, there's a lot of house music is made on the keyboard by people who aren't really great musicians, and they can play enough that they can, stick in some chords, maybe in a bass line or whatever. But I remember once working on a remix and I played in a riff on this remix, and this was in the late 90s, and the keyboard player just came in to do another session, and this was just playing this remix at the time. I think we were just running it off to DAT. And he said, oh, who's playing that riff? And I said, it's me. And he's just let me replay it. He just played it and he put a bit more expression on the mod wheel and made the sound filter a little bit more. He was doing that as he played it, and it wasn't completely in time like my one had been quantized, and it just sounded better. It was the same notes, but it just was played a bit better. And I thought, well, that sounds better than mine. So I learnt a lesson then, which I've, that's sometimes, it depends what sort of music you're making as well. Obviously, if you're making techno, then this maybe isn't relevant. It's all about the sound, and it doesn't need to have a live feel or but I always think having a musician in the room is useful, or having had one in for the. So anyway, so one track it might start off with a sample, or it might start off with some. I've got notes in my phone. If I hear when I'm in the car, I often try and buy new music and new old music to listen to, and even new music which I haven't got Spotify or anything like that in my car. I'm still listening to CDs, so I would buy albums I used to listen to a lot, maybe, or someone might recommend something to me, and I'll buy stuff on CDs and compilations on CDs, just so my brain's hearing new music and not just soul, funk, disco, some other sorts of stuff as well. And anything interesting I hear, I think, oh, that's quite an interesting riff, or that's quite a nice sound, or that's a nice chord progression. I'll just write that down as a note. So I've just got something, so I'm not going to copy it exactly, but it's just something interesting that I've got as a note in my phone. So when I'm working on something, maybe when we've put in some chords and a bass line, I think, well, what should we do next? Oh, that record had that interesting sort of like arpeggio riff or whatever. Let's have a listen to that. And it just is a source of inspiration rather than just relying on what you're going to come up with that at that moment. So I that would be. And chords are very important to me. So anytime I was listening to a Narada Michael Walden CD in the car was it this morning or last night? And it was one of the track. It only sort of passing chord section. Oh, they're nice chords at the end of this track. I thought, let me just write them down. And then maybe we might, I might say to the keyboard player, can you copy those chords? And then we might play them in a different order and it's in a different key. But it's just sometimes those things aren't, I found, the sort of parts that keyboard players are going to come up with unless you actually steer them to do that. They're going to tend to come up with the first thing that comes into their head that's often going to be more standard. So if you can direct people to do something a bit different, more unique, even though you're copying it from something else, you're copying it for something that perked up your ears, that you thought, oh, that's quite an interesting riff. You play them that, and then, it's not going to really sound that similar to that, but it is it's just a starting point and a direction. So, I mean, this is going on throughout the process of making the record. I mean, it might be like another track, it starts off with a sample, and I'll start off with a sample, and then I might write a song over the sample, and then I might keep the sample in there, I might get the sample recreated, or I might get rid of the sample and then treat that song like a remix where I've got the vocal. I think, well, I've got a pretty good song here. Let's treat it as though I was remixing it for someone else and completely change the music, because, now I've got the song in place. I don't think it's worth making that sample the central point of the record. So always being prepared to, change things if you think that is what's necessary, not just stick with something because that was been there the whole time. You think, well, because I started with the sample doesn't mean I have to leave the sample in there forever, and I've done an album. The next album project I'm releasing is with a lady called Marissa Rose from Detroit, and I heard her singing on a Theo Parrish track, and I got in contact with her on Facebook. It took about 6 months to reply, but she did eventually reply, and we kind of corresponded a bit and spoke on the phone. I ended up flying her over. We spent 2 weeks in the studio, and she is somebody who's a pleasure to work with because she's a good songwriter. And there was a lady who reminds me of, who I used to work with, called Diane Charlemagne, who was a great songwriter as well. Also had a lovely voice, was really good with harmonies. And if you're making song-based music, working with someone who's a good writer, as well as all the other things, having a nice voice, and is so much easier than if you're, I've written songs myself. The entire song, the melody, the lyrics, it doesn't come naturally to me. I can do it, but I'm much better as a co-writer than I am as a songwriter. So I know what my limitations are, and I know it's more enjoyable and much quicker if I do it with somebody else. But it's got to be somebody else who you think, you kind of get on with in the studio and you're on the same page, and, you're not kind of pulling each other, and there's no ego involved in terms of like, oh, I've thought of that line, so I've got to have it in the song. If someone comes up with a better line, then the better line, your line goes and their line replaces it. So, and I suppose you've got to have a similar melodic sense of what you think is, you both like the same things, rather than somebody finding something corny or somebody else finding something too, I don't know, but you've got to be on the same page, basically. So, and with the songs I did with her, for example, quite a lot of those were just ideas which I'd had for backing tracks, which I knew needed a singer. So again, it might be that I had an idea for a bass line, we put in some chords over the bass line. It's pretty basic. But for working with singers, sometimes it's basic. They don't want loads of riffs going off all over the place, and they don't want really complicated chords that's going to dictate the melody and make it harder for them to write over. So once she'd left, then I started working on the tracks a bit more and developing them and adding different sections and things like that. Is sometimes easier to do that afterwards, unless it's going to change key or something like that, where obviously you need the singer to change key. And recording live stuff, you don't want to record guitar and bass and all this live musician parts, when the singer might start singing and the key doesn't really suit them. And you think, she said, oh, can you transpose me, down a couple of semitones? And you think, well, that's much easier when it's all MIDI. Once you've got live stuff, you can do it with a pitch transposer or in Melodyne or whatever, but it's going to affect the quality. And especially if you're going downwards with something like a bass, it's best to do all of that after you've recorded the vocals. So that would be normally my process if I'm working on a song-based track. If I think this is another song for Marissa, it would just be MIDI to start with, and then once we've got something which I would consider a good song that's worth pursuing, then I would start working on it more, and maybe then record live musicians and that sort of stuff. That's the icing on the cake. You don't want to start putting the icing on the cake before you bake the cake, basically.
You have worked with a huge list of artists and producers and singers and songwriters and musicians in your time. When you start collaborations, how do you create a synergy? How do you feel that you get the best out of your musicians and the artists and songwriters that you work with?
I mean, I don't know if I always do. I just be myself, and we have a chat, and we talk about music and talk about life in general. So I think it's always nice to do that for an hour or so. Talk about what you're doing, what your situation is at home and where you live and things. Just have a general chat, see if you get on. But then when it actually comes to working, I mean, there's definitely times where I've worked with people and they've come up with something. I think I quite like it, but I don't love it. But I haven't really got any other ideas. So sometimes it's just, and then maybe you're better to say, well, actually, it's difficult because when you're first working with somebody and you feel you need to sort of kind of prove yourself to some degree that you've got, what it takes for them to be worth collaborating with. And sometimes they'll sing something and you think, oh, I really like that, or I don't like it, or what. But other times you just don't feel like, especially with sometimes with a backing track where I've worked on the backing track quite a lot, I can't come up with any hooks for it because I've kind of heard it too many times. So you're hoping they're going to come up with something and you think, oh, yes, that sounds good, but how about changing it to this, or how about doing that? And I've definitely, over the years, definitely come up with some good stuff in conjunction with other people, and we've worked together and we've improved something and we got it to a good place. But then there's other times I've had people in and we just haven't, and that's just going to happen sometimes. So, and it's not, you're not to say that they're not, you just haven't connected. You might have connected before you started recording, but when actually came to the recording, and maybe if you'd worked on a different backing track and you might have just heard some other melodies and come up with some other lyric ideas. I mean, one thing I normally do if I'm working with a singer is I would play them. I'd play them through a few tracks, which I'd say, is there any of these you like or feel inspired by? I'd also have a list of titles. So rather than trying to come up with a title on the day, anytime somebody says something interesting, like just an interesting turn of phrase, or it might be the title of a movie or a book or a line I see in a book or whatever, I'll write it down as a potential title for a song. So, and I just think if you've got an interesting title, you're more likely to come up with an interesting verse. If your titles move your body, you're pretty restricted about where you're likely to go with that lyrically or whatever. Certain songs, the title does tend to, dictate where you go with the rest of it. So I would have some. So I'd suggest some. Say, is there any of these titles that appeal to you? And you're just looking for some synergy. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't, and probably more often than not, it doesn't. Realistically, especially as you get a bit older. And you've made I had a singer in the studio a few years ago. She's a very nice lady, and we worked on a few things. And I just thought, none of this, it's all right, but none of it's really, I'm not feeling like I really want to finish this. You should feel like you really want to finish it. You should feel like really excited. I remember one of my tracks from a few years ago, which I did with Diane, called The Secret Life of Us by the Sunburst Band. And that was a song where I'd done the backing track with Michaela Chavarini, the keyboard player. And what we'd done is we just listened to some change and some Mauro Malavasi productions, the Italian guy who was behind Change and High Fashion. And we just listened to it, and I said, look, he's got very distinctive chord progressions in his music. And Michaela listened, and we copied a few of the chords. And I said, like now you've kind of got inside his head of how his chords work. Let's come up with a new set of chords that kind of in with that as the kind of like if he was here now, what chords he'd come up with for a new song. So we just kind of using that as the sort of like the blueprint, but let's come up with something original. And I did this track and I thought it's nice chords, I like it. And we did some different chords for the verse, and I put in some little bits like he would do, where it's got like a half bar turnaround going into the verse, and so it's just kind of, but it's just a track, just piano, bass, and a very basic beat. And I had an idea for that being a male vocal track. I thought this sounds like it should be a guy singing it. And one time when Diane was in, and still I would get Diane and we'd work on lots of tracks. We'd work maybe finishing off the one we did last month, and then maybe we'd write a new one, or she'd do some BVs on something. And I think I played her this. I said, "What do you think of this?" And she said, "Oh, I really like it." And she just started singing the hook straight away. She started singing I'm not going to sing it because that sounds good in my voice. And I straight away thought, oh, that sounds great. That's really good. And we just recorded a demo of it very quickly, just as a chorus. And that's how you should feel when you've written something. You should feel like, that's it, sounds great. And I remember when I did Must Be the Music with Akaboo, I had an idea for a hook, just the idea of the type of hook I wanted, with like a high note and then the phrase at the end of the high note. And I kind of explained to her, and then she just started singing it. And I thought, that's it. There was no doubt. And then other times it's been a long process of like writing a bit there and writing, like maybe coming up with a chorus, and then maybe taking a few lines from that chorus and moving them around within the bar and repeating things. And sometimes that can end up with something pretty good. And sometimes that can end up with something that's actually, you think, actually, this isn't any good. But you just have to try, and you have to maybe think, well, that one just somehow there's something intrinsically missing from that track, which even though a lot of the parts, the bass line is okay and the chords are okay and the hook on its own, I've listened to it. Sometimes I'll come back to something which I've been having some problems with, and it's been a year since I've listened to it. And I think maybe I'm just going to hear this and have that Eureka moment where I'm going to think, I know what I should do with this. And I might spend like 45 minutes of it on it and get back to the same place I was a year ago last time, where I've kind of try this, try that. No, it still doesn't really lift when it goes into the chorus, or there's something. And then I think, okay, let's put this. And that's a great thing. One of the great things about the way you can work now in terms of just opening a project and it being exactly where it was. You don't have to load the tape onto the tape machine and get the levels up again. You just can open it and it's there, and you can write it off all over again.